This is an overview of Chapter 3 of the Openstax Psychology 2nd edition textbook. The topic is biopsychology, which is not a topic I'm very fond of. It's also a topic I don't know a lot about, so I will do my best. So, biopsychologists look at the nervous system, they look at brain matter, nerve cells, neurotransmitters, also things like genes and DNA to try to understand human experience and the psychological faculties that humans have. One of the key features is looking at the brain and nervous system. So we'll spend quite a bit of time looking at those two places. The first place, however, is that humans, all animals, pass down genes from parents to children in the case of animals, and that those genes predispose organisms to growing in certain ways and developing certain traits. And so genes and the DNA therein can predict what you'll look like and what sort of personality traits you're likely to develop, as well as in psychology, what disorders or diseases you are likely to develop. So because genetics plays a role in psychology, we can look at the work of Charles Darwin to understand how humans have become the way that they are, or how you in particular have become the way that you are. We can understand that by looking at your parents and your parents' parents, and then backing all the way up to like ancestors 10 generations removed. This is like a little image of that. This is natural selection, so there are lots of traits in all of these organisms, and then over the years, only certain traits survive. The idea is that those traits are the strongest ones, and that the traits that die or die off, the people that die off there, and this is like many generations, the traits that don't survive don't have survival value, so only the ones that do survive persist. So we can look at human personality and traits that have survived and make a case that perhaps they have survival value. There's certain animal behaviors that are better predicted by evolution than environment. Anyway, interesting point here about how the propensity for a fatal disease can actually have survival value. I'll let you read that. So what happens when genes are being passed? Well, there's DNA and made up of chromosomes and alleles. I'll let you read about that. I find this very boring. Just because you have genes and you carry genes doesn't mean they'll be expressed. So a phenotype is the gene that has been expressed. So genotype is all of the genetic material that you have. The phenotype is that material that's been expressed. So for example, my mom had red hair, I had blonde hair, but it's possible for the blonde hair was my phenotype, even though red hair is part of my genotype, and I could have a child with red hair, even though I didn't have red hair. More boring. My mom and dad, and just as your mom and dad, biological that is, had certain, for every potential trait being passed, there is a dominant and recessive trait given by the mother and a dominant recessive trait given by the father, and then their likelihood of being expressed is in this probability chart here, if you want to have some fun with genes. The environment allows your genetic traits to be expressed, or allows your genes to be expressed. If I have a genetic propensity to defend myself when attacked, like maybe it's something that's allowed my ancestral lineage to survive as long as it has, it will never be expressed in me if I'm never put in a position where I have to defend myself. And so it would exist in my genotype, but epigenetically it would never be expressed, so you would never see it, and perhaps that capability would never be established in me. So with epigenetics, we can find genetic changes in one generation. Okay, so we've left behind genetics. We're moving into the structure of the neuron, the nerve cell. There's a colorful picture of it. The nerve cell, I'm surprised to find out, or surprised to learn, is actually quite large. You have billions of them, but they're tightly packed. But they might stretch like a full inch in size. But imagine in that inch how many thousands of other neurons they're bumping up against. So we've got like the cell body here. These are the dendrites that receive messages from other axon terminals here. And then there's the axon, which sends the message from the cell body down to the terminal. The terminal is where they release. So you see like this is releasing a message to another cell body. Then we have like the same thing here. It almost looks like there's a chain, but really they're like clustered on top of each other, like going every which way. So it's not always like a clear, it's not like a rope that's created. It's a lot more interconnected than the pictures kind of suggest. That's just me showing off what I do know about this topic. If you were to look at a visual, or his actual picture of that, so the synapse, that's the space, so right here between the terminal buttons and then the dendrites, this is what it actually looks like under a microscope, 100 millimeters. These are neurotransmitters that are released and then attached to the receptors, and then some of them don't get absorbed into the dendrite and cell body, and so they might get reuptaken by the terminal button. I've been a psychologist for like 12 years and I've never used that. I've never used this like image. It's never helped me in any way. But I'm not a neuropsychologist, so if you go into psychopharmacology, this will be very important for you. Here's a chemical breakdown of what's happening when the message is discharged. Then there's an actual change in the charge of the cell. And during that period with the change in charge, the cell can't fire again. So that's called, that whole process is called action potential. So you can break it down into depolarization, hyperpolarization, excitation, and so on. I'll let you read about which is which. There is a graph of the charge going from negative to positive and back to negative again. I mentioned reuptake earlier, so I won't go into it again. There are a bunch of neurotransmitters that psychologists are interested in, including acetylcholine, beta-endorphin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. I'm sure you've heard of a lot of those. In particular, dopamine is popular as a source of pleasure and happiness. Serotonin affecting sleep and mood, and so that's used or interacted with. That's the target of a lot of antidepressants. See, all very boring, unless you're a psychopharmacologist. Not going into that. I remember professors talking about that, but again, never used it. Parts of the nervous system. There's the CNS, central nervous system, and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord, densely packed neurons, and then the peripheral nervous system, that's what you're kind of in control over. You can move, you can have sensations, and you're consciously aware of that. The peripheral nervous system can be divided and then divided and then divided. The most interesting, in my opinion, division is the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic meaning it works independently of conscious awareness, automatic. It can be divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system is like the active movement, ready to go, fight or flight. The parasympathetic is the relax, calm, sleeping sort of rest and restore response. Those are the divisions. Here's another way of looking at the sympathetic activity versus parasympathetic activity. If you are stressed out a lot, you are in the sympathetic state. If you are lethargic and tired, you're parasympathetic. You need to have both throughout the day in order to be active and then to rebuild and restore, become stronger again. The brain is comprised of billions of interconnected neurons and glia being the fatty tissue and the fatty lipids that cover the axon, the cell axons. The brain is two-sided. You'll see it's divided into lobes in a bunch of different ways in a little bit. The spinal cord, interestingly, has its own system of reflexes. I didn't know that. Delivers messages to and from the brain, obviously. Can be organized into 30 segments. Bring messages both ways. Okay. The two hemispheres. Here's a picture of the brain, one of about 15 pictures of the brain you'll see. Lateralization is the word that describes that there's two sides, so it's bilateral. There's both sides of the brain. The right hemisphere controls the left half of the body. The left hemisphere controls the right half of the body. There's also differences in awareness and perception and action that can be handled by each side of the brain. Some people would argue that there is no hemispheric differences. A gyrus is the the thumb-looking lumps, and then the sulci are the little gaps between the lumps, and then the longitudinal fissure runs between both hemispheres. So there's some vocabulary for you. The left and right hemispheres, so we're looking at it from the front, are connected by the corpus callosum, and there's like a gross picture, I can't even look of it in a dissected brain. This picture shows the brain divided in a new way into forebrain, midbrain, and hindbrain. And in this picture, the forebrain includes all of the cerebral cortex as well as this part of what I would call the midbrain. I'm not sure why it's included in the forebrain in this picture, but there's the corpus callosum and the limbic system, I believe, right in here, and pituitary gland, and then I think the thalamus is here, but we'll look at that in a second in a more detailed breakdown picture. Hindbrain has the medulla oblongata, cerebellum, and then I think something else here, pons possibly. The cerebral cortex is all of the wrinkly tissue here, and so it is responsible for the higher order processes. The thalamus, the sensory relay. Hypothalamus is the autonomic nervous system control. Pituitary gland controls all the endocrine systems. And the limbic system is responsible for emotion. Here's another subdivision of the brain, looking only at the cerebral cortex. We have the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes, each of which has a variety of features and capabilities. The frontal lobe, the first part, so like here, has the motor cortex, prefrontal cortex, Broca's area, which is responsible for language production. Interesting case about someone who had a railroad spike go through his frontal lobe, and his personality was changed. His motivation and planning and memory and all of that were changed, even though he was still able to go to work and have conversations and eat food. People thought he was okay, but there was like this bizarre change. His children didn't recognize him. His coworkers didn't really, couldn't connect with him anymore. And so we kind of learned about what the frontal lobe does because of this horrible, horrible accident. The parietal lobe includes the somatosensory cortex, so that's the touch awareness of the body, so being able to feel things on your hands, elbows, and so on. The primary motor cortex works very much the same way, but that's the motor control. I guess that was frontal lobe, parietal lobe, it's sensory processes. Mentioned Broca's area, speech production. Wernicke's area is speech understanding or language comprehension. So temporal lobe, frontal lobe. This is a retinotopical picture of the brain, and the green area is called the occipital lobe, and it is primarily responsible for interpreting visual information, visual processing. I think it's also partially responsible for problem solving, like language, or excuse me, logic, although I could be mistaken. All right, so remember I pointed to that gap right there, and here it sort of looks like that was the thalamus, so I think I was correct. I didn't lead you astray. Um, Again, corpus callosum, I think pituitary gland, um, hypothalamus is in here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. Ha, right there. I was almost exactly right. The amygdala is that little circle there. That's responsible for fear response, and we're saying tying emotional meaning to memories. That's pretty cool. Hippocampus, um, strongly associated with learning and memory. That would be this little connection point there. Yeah, so that's the limbic system. So I think earlier I said the limbic system is somewhere in here. That was down lower. Another identical picture, but without any captions. This has the reticular formation, substantia nigra, and ventral tegmental area. I remember learning those words in my neuropsychology class in college, though I couldn't tell you what they do. Reticular formation, important in regulating the sleep-wake cycle, arousal, alertness, and motor activity. The substantia nigra, where dopamine is produced. I don't even recognize that term, I'll be honest. Dopamine, we'll see in the neurotransmitter list in a minute what it does. Ventral tegmental area, where dopamine is also produced. So I'm curious about the difference between those two. I'm the wrong person to ask. The medulla controls breathing, blood pressure, heart rate. We don't have direct control over those. The pons connects the brain and spinal cord. Well, that's disappointing. It's just the point of connection. I sort of hoped it would do more than that. The cerebellum controls balance, coordination, and movement. That's this, I guess, bell-shaped. Looks more like a pine cone, if I'm being honest. So that whole area is the brainstem. Yeah, that very dangerous if that gets injured. On to more exciting brain stuff. Imaging techniques. How am I doing on time for my day? Okay. All right, let's go through some of these. This is a CT scan, which evidently is really only helpful for viewing tumors or any like abnormal growths. A PET scan, a positron emission tomography, can help see. Let's see what this does. Mildly radioactive substance. Okay, so this is you're injected with a mildly radioactive substance that then courses through your brain, and you can see activity. So, like, I'm guessing the dark areas is where activity is occurring, and the light, cold areas are where no activity is occurring. So you can sort of predict what is going on in this person simply by looking at what areas of their brain are active. I'm not going to attempt that here. Magnetic resonance imaging and functional magnetic resonance imaging. I'm not really sure what makes it functional. I've never really known. But here we can see, I know that MRIs measure blood flow, and so the lit up, if you will, areas represent that blood is, I think, leaving these areas. So like there's blood activity, there's action, not the heat of a PET scan, but blood flow. And you can look at slices of brain and go from the very top down to the very bottom and look at different slices. This cool hat is called an electroencephalography wig or helmet, I'm not sure, but it measures electrical impulses on the scalp. The idea is it's getting brainwave activities. So that's the least, they're all uninvasive. It's the least of a hassle, I suppose. Look at this kid can sit at a computer while he wears that hat, whereas this person needs to be on their back and then like inserted into a giant magnet. The endocrine system, now we're finally getting into something that I think is, I personally think is beneficial to understand as a psychologist. The endocrine system involves all the glands in the body and the hormones that they release that regulate things like mood and hunger and sexual arousal, and growth, and moderate blood sugar and sodium and so on. So all very important to health, well-being, and perhaps psychological disorders. So we can look at how health impacts psychological well-being. But you can look at individually what those glands are and what they are responsible for. And if you needed a picture of like where the gonads are or where the uterus is and ovaries are, there's a picture. We're assuming generally that this is all potential types of people wrapped into one. Okay, so here's a list of neurotransmitters. I feel like I need to go back and say it could be a hermaphroditic person. I'm not trying to criticize the presence or absence of certain endocrine systems or glandular systems. Neurotransmitters, here's a list of the main neurotransmitter, and then what they do, and then how they affect behavior. So let's pick one. Dopamine, responsible for mood. That's like happy or depressed. Sleep, that's when you go to bed at night. Learning, that's when you're being educated. Increased pleasure, suppressed appetite, that's maybe how it would affect your behavior. But of course, because of their effects, these are going to be important. Oh, and I've reached the end. Oh, what happiness. I've reached the end of the chapter 3 slides. We have gone through a tour of the human body and reflected on how those things can influence the mind and behavior.